Hey, what's up guys, it's Mike with Alpha Reptile back with another video today, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to build a custom vivarium. Well, in this case it's actually a paludarium, but that's besides the point. This video is going to help you go from a brand new tank that's shiny in its plastic all the way to an established ecosystem so you can enjoy a beautiful slice of nature in your own home. Let's get started. First things first, you're going to want to get all the materials together for the build before you start. Believe me, I've started projects before without all the materials and I end up regretting it later in the future. I'll leave all the links to everything I possibly can in the description down below. They are affiliates, so I do get a tiny little cut of whatever you decide to buy at no extra cost to you. You'll just have to click the Show More tab down below. You're going to find everything that you need down there. In addition to that, I will leave the link to the Frogs & Co website. That is the Exo Terra tank that we're going to be using. It highlights the features of the tanks as well as all of the new products that they launched alongside of. Now, arguably the most important thing that you're going to need is the tank. For this build, I'm using the brand new Exo Terra Tree Frog Terrarium. This is one of their new products. I do want to quickly thank Exo Terra for sponsoring this video, for sending me out the tank as well as many of the supplies. This brand new Exo Terra tank features one door for your viewing pleasure, a partially solid lid with a glass cutout to improve humidity retention, as well as a built-in management system for the misting tubes of their Exo Terra Monsoon Mister. Now that we've established what tank we're going to be using, I'm tricking this tank out with a custom background using the dry lock method for those of you that are wondering. Now let's talk about what you're going to need for that. First things first, you're going to need spray foam. I'm using the black landscape foam, but any spray foam will do. It's not really a huge deal. In addition to that, I am using cotton balls and super glue. Now this has to be a liquid super glue, not the gel stuff, and you basically mix it with the cotton. It creates a very hot exothermic reaction and bonds very tightly with whatever comes in contact with it, so it'll be useful for holding up our hardscape temporarily. One of the most critical parts of a dry lock background is the dry lock itself. I'm using dry lock standard. You can see it on screen right now. It was a method popularized by my good buddy Troy Goldberg. If you haven't seen him, go check him out, but we're just gonna hop right into it and show you some of these wicked frogs.
Cool.
So if you have any questions about it, leave it in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you. Now, to put the fine details on the background, we also need acrylic paints. This isn't a necessary step, it's just useful to create a more naturalistic background with a little bit more depth and texture to it. Of course, we are going to need a little bit of silicone. I'll show you why later. And finally, the wood or the hardscape. I am currently using manzanita in this tank, but you can use anything like driftwood, cork bark, whatever you choose. Just make sure that you check that it holds up to high humidity environments. Now, moving on to the water section of this build, because I did mention that it is a paludarium, we're going to need the following. First off, you're going to need some rocks. I'm currently using dragonstone in this build, but you can really use whatever rocks you're interested in. Just make sure that you know the chemistry of the rock, because sometimes the rocks can actually change the chemistry of the water that is surrounding it. I also used a pump. I didn't actually film any of this, but I did end up using a pump for water circulation. I think that it is necessary. For drainage, I'm using the Exo Terra Biodrain. This is a porous lava rock and can be used for your builds. Of course, to separate the drainage from the actual substrate, you need some mesh. I am using the Exo Terra Biodrain mesh in this build. And finally, for the full substrate itself, I am experimenting and using the Substratum, one of the brand new products from Exo Terra. It is loaded with nutrients and beneficial organisms, so it'll be good for the plants as well as the animals. Finally, the accessories that are going into the tank. For the lighting, I am using the Exo Terra Terra Sky LED. It is, again, one of the new products that were launched with the tank and the other products that I've mentioned. And of course, for the misting, I am using the Exo Terra Monsoon Multi. If you wanted to, you could use the Solo in this tank, but Exo Terra was nice enough to send me the Multi, so I will be using that. Now that you've heard the list of everything that you're going to need, please keep in mind that I will link everything in the description that I possibly can for you guys to go check out. Now, let's stop blabbling and let's get building. First things first is taking the tank out of the plastic, and of course removing all the components that come with it, because this isn't just a standard Exo Terra tank. I did want to say a couple things about the unboxing experience. Firstly, the glue that they use to hold the box down to the bottom of the tank is very strong and typically remains stuck to the tank, so you will need a razor blade or something in order to get it off. I have heard they are going to try and fix this. Additionally, mine had the drain actually pre-installed in the unit. However, in the future batches that are going to be released and found in your stores now, they will have the drain yet to be installed. So very easy process, just follow the instructions and screw it on there. Now, what's the first thing that you should do when you get a brand new tank and you're going to be keeping water in it? Or I guess it would be the second thing in this case, because you've already taken it out of the box. That's right. It's putting it through a water test. So I filled the tank and left it sit overnight, ensuring there is no water on the table. The next morning, of course, there wasn't, so it's watertight. That actually allows me to test out the brand new drain and drain the water to see how this works. Now, something that you have to do before doing that, though, is actually installing the tubing. Installing the tubing was quite difficult, and that's coming from somebody that's been in the fish hobby for over a decade. My recommended procedures that you guys should follow is taking some boiling water, dipping the end of the tube into that water. That allows the water to soften the tube, and that'll make it expand over the barbed end of the drain that you're going to need to slide it onto, and it should work. But like I said, this wasn't all that easy, so if you don't get it the first time, just try it again, and eventually you'll get it. All right, now that we have all of our T's crossed and our I's dotted, let's go to the background and start spray foaming. So what you're going to want to do is shake the snot out of the can and start adding your first layer down. I go side to side, up and down, whatever you need to do in order to cover the background. For this build, I believe I used about 1.5 cans of the smaller, so the 12-ounce cans, I believe. One of the 16-ounce cans should work for the tank that I'm showing today. I'm using the pond foam. That's the black foam that is proven to be animal safe and use in ponds, just out of an abundance of caution, but I've also built backgrounds from any standard spray foam. As long as it's gassed off and cured, you should be good. After you've laid down the first blanket of foam, you should let it cure for about 24 to 48 hours. That'll ensure that the foam is actually cured all the way through and is no longer a mushy paste on the inside. Believe me, I've cut into foam and it is a mistake that you will only make once, especially if you're not wearing gloves. And once you've let it cure, it's time to start carving. Now, carving can be done in a couple different ways. The main purpose of carving is to remove all of the extremely flat surfaces that the cured spray foam leaves. So you're going to want to be cutting this shiny surface and revealing the porous foam below. Why you want to do this, you might ask? Well, that's because neither the spray foam that we use to adhere our branches to, the silicone that we're going to use to hold down the background, or the dry lock that we use will stick to the cured foam. So it's critical that you remove all of that shiny, gross looking foam. When I'm carving, I'm thinking about a couple different things. A, what the background might look when finished. So I'm trying to carve things that look vaguely like rocks or crevasses that I can paint later, or branches that I could work in. I'm thinking about that the whole time when I'm carving my background. I'm not just trying to carve it as a flat panel. In addition to that, I'm also thinking of where I might be wanting to put driftwood, or where the driftwood will be put once I'm done carving. Now, with that said, the foam has been carved. You have taken some mental notes on where you might think the wood would look good, and now you can move on to actually taking some time to decide where that wood is going to go. This is a process that you really don't want to rush. Place it in the tank. You can use the super glue to adhere it and let it sit there so you don't have to tape it up with a bunch of different tape or whatever, but just leave it there. Give it some time to marinate. Maybe go have dinner, go talk to a friend, go do something in the reptile room, or even go to sleep on it and come back the next morning with a fresh, open mind and really think critically. Okay, is this the tank that I really desire, or do I think that I can make it look better by moving the wood? Now that you've decided that you like where the wood has been placed, you can use the super glue and cotton ball method, which is essentially getting the super glue, mixing it up with the cotton ball, and then holding it in place. This is an extremely exothermic reaction, which means it gets very hot. So you're definitely going to want to put on gloves before you do this, and try not to touch the glue, the foam, the wood, wherever it's touching with your fingers at all. You might want to use some tweezers or a wooden skewer or something along those lines in order to prevent a burn. Unfortunately, it didn't actually work quite so well for us, but it still did its purpose. Naturally, you'd see smoke and things like that, but in ours, it basically just cured really strongly to the foam. Something that I mentioned in the beginning, and I do want to reiterate now, is that it has to be a liquid super glue. You do not want to use gel. You do not want to use a semi-viscous cyanoacrylate or super glue. You just want as liquidy as you possibly can get it. The beauty about this is, like I mentioned, you can attach it to the background and wait and change your mind if you really need to. Or you can do what I did and use it as a final setting tool. So now you don't have to prop up your wood with tape or a can or a pot or whatever. You can just set it into the background and then follow the next step, which is foaming the driftwood into the background, really locking it in place and making sure that it stays there and is not going anywhere. Once you've added the spray foam to the driftwood, you can just repeat the process. That is letting it sit, then carving it, and now it's time for the fun part. But before we get to that fun part, I do have to mention there is one step that I have recently begun doing, and that is adding a bead of silicone around the foam before dry locking. After some terrible experiences in the past with dry lock peeling up my backgrounds, flashback to my chameleon builds. So after this first coat of dry lock, I have run into an issue. Some of you guys might see it right off the bat, some of you might not. What the issue is over there, you can see that the drying dry lock must have some sort of shrinking effect on the actual foam itself, so it begins to shrink away from the glass. You can see the gap there. It's not ideal. I do run a bead around the entire edge of the tank. Now that can be the interior edges if there's holes with no foam and exposed glass, or in my case, because it was just one panel of foam, there was no intricacies in the middle, I can just run a bead of silicone all around the four sides and let it dry. So leave it overnight, and I came back to it the next morning. But now is the time we've all been waiting for. It's dry locking time. I used a cheap paintbrush to apply the layers. There's a couple different ways you can do it. I found this to be the easiest way. Depending on how many layers you're doing, typically I do 2 to 3. Will determine on if you're going to use the dye or not. If you're building a background for a larger lizard or something like that that has a decently sharp claws, you might want to consider doing more than 3 or 4 layers, but in my case, I only did 2. So I used the colorant on the base layer and then built up over it after that. When mixing the colorants in with the dry lock, it's really nothing special. You just got to mix it to wherever you think looks good and go from there. Allowed me to channel my inner Bob Ross and make some happy little magic. Once the first few coats are on and I'm happy with the way the background looks, I then move to some acrylic paint and start adding some different textures and colors to the tank using a variety of different techniques, including dry brushing, which involves me drying off the brush before applying it to the background, and you just use a very light technique so you can capture some highlights on the edges of the rock. And also I use a sponge and dab the green to make something look like moss. Now this is something that isn't recommended by many people, but it is super important, and that is sealing the acrylic paint. The acrylic is not waterproof. In something like this where there will be water constantly and amphibians, that is something that we need to pay attention to and take enough time to actually seal the paint in. In this case, I am using a liquid varnish and I applied 2 thin layers across the entire background. And this is what it looks like. Now that I've varnished the entire tank, the background is virtually finished. However, there was one more step that I did, and that is add some silicone and dried moss to the background. It adds a little bit of variety to the tank and also acts as an anchoring point for some of the vines and other plants that I'm going to be attaching. Here's where we go a little bit crazy. Now we can make our rock barrier, which is going to separate the land from the water portion. Now this took a couple of hours for me to get right and to get it where I liked it. I did use a couple different things, like more of the super glue and cotton ball method in order to hold some of the smaller stones together. While I'm doing that, let's talk about rocks. In this case, I'm using dragonstone because of its texture. It has a lot of holes and different crevices where you can put moss, plants, whatever you desire. Plus, it looks pretty epic. I mean, I just love the look, and the name is really cool too. Now, something you'll want to pay attention to is avoid using multiple different kinds of stone, as it appears disorganized and a little careless. When you think about nature, rocks are all typically very regional, meaning that in one body of water, you're only going to really find one different kind of rock, unless humans have come along and dispersed some, of course. But for the most part, they might be weathered differently, there might be different mosses growing on them, but they are the same rock. Hence why I decided to plan ahead and really only use the one kind of stone in the entire build. Also, I mentioned this before, make sure you are aware of what rocks you're using and if they may alter water chemistry. There are some rocks out there that do alter the pH of your water, so it's something to keep in mind if you're using this for any animal really, but especially frogs. Now, after the few painstaking hours that it took to get the rocks in the place that I wanted them, it's finished, and it's time to build up the land portion. Now let's start off with a biodrain as the drainage layer. Please ensure that you wash this before adding it to your tank. You might think they look clean, but when you wash them under the sink, it is disturbing how much powder and ground up rock there is that falls through your strainer. Now, in addition to the lava rock that you see me using here, I do use some filter foam pads that I had lying around just to boost up the general height of the drainage layer and push the plants a little bit higher out of the water table. Now, as I'm recording this voiceover a couple months after planning the tank, in hindsight, I would really have liked to put up the drainage layer a little bit higher because some of the plants didn't take well to a relatively moist soil. After I've set the drainage layer to where I want it, now I can finally use the biodrain mesh, cut it to size, and put it over top. Before we get into planting, you of course have to put in your substrate, and in this case I'm experimenting with using only the Exo Terra substratum. Now, I don't know how this is going to work long term, but so far it is working very well. The plants are growing well and seem to be settling into this new environment fairly well. Now that we've added our substratum into the tank and into the water area, we can begin my favorite part, and that is planting. Well, okay, I must admit, before we start into the planting, I do have to go around the room and shop for whatever plants I want to put in. Thankfully, Bree and I had picked a few out, but now I can go and pick out whichever ones I enjoy. If you're wanting to learn a little bit about beginner vivarium plants, click the card in the top right hand corner of your screen. That'll bring you to my top 10 best beginner vivarium plants. They are fairly affordable and won't break the bank when you're deciding to plant your first terrarium and not really sure about what goes into it just yet. Now that I've done my shopping, I've gone around the room and I've come up with the plants that you see here. But what are the plants without putting them into the tank? Now I need to figure out where I'm going to plant them, and that is a very important step to consider when planting your tank. You need to consider the growth habit of the plants. Some are epiphytic, some are vines, there's bromeliads that are also epiphytic, but there's just so much variety in the tropical plant world that you really need to consider how they're going to grow into a space, how big they're going to get, if they're going to vine, if they're going to climb, if they're going to send runners throughout the tank. These are all things that you need to consider. You might not have a handle on it quite yet, but over time, you'll learn, you'll tweak, and you'll grow. In this terrarium, I did end up adding some springtails. I might experiment and add some isopods later in the future. I guess you could say that this tank is bioactive, although even that is a very loose definition. Now, with planting wrapped up, it is time for me to set up the Monsoon System. That is one of the features that is really cool about this terrarium. I mentioned it in the beginning, but I can finally show you it now. And that is the tracking system that Exo Terra has built into these tanks in order to accommodate the tubing as well as the nozzle of the Monsoon without needing to suction cup it to the glass. It just looks a lot cleaner, saves space, and is a little bit more permanent of a solution. So it's pretty easy. You just slide the tube in through the back, through their brand new redesigned hole system, and then run it along the sides of the tank up to where your nozzle will be sitting. All right, now that we've got the Monsoon set up, it's time to give it a test. It isn't quiet, as you can hear now, but it does work fairly well. I'm not going to be including what animals I'm going to be adding into this setup because it is a very critical step that you allow your tank to grow in for a month or two, as this time period lets your plants grow new roots, start growing new leaves, and actually establishing in the soil. But it does more than that. It allows time for your cleanup crew to start ramping up their production and their numbers to deal eventually larger bioload from whatever animals you're going to be putting in there. But here is the final tank. If you did make it to the very end of the video, you are the real MVP and I really appreciate it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I'll be posting many different builds throughout the coming months, and we got a heck of a reptile room coming at you this month, so click subscribe. If you liked the video, make sure you click like, and if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you haven't followed me on Instagram, I do post a lot of this stuff early on there for you guys to check out and enjoy, so that's also probably the best place to speak to me one-on-one, so follow me there. And I want to thank you all very much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Later.